Now we finally come to the last question in this test, C part 2. Discuss whether the data given is sufficient to conclude, so sorry, there's a typo here, to conclude if Japan or the USA had the higher standard of living, presumably 1996, right? The word discuss is your directive word. So the word discuss is a high order thinking skill directive word. High order thinking skill, shorthand, HOTS or HOTS directive word. So indicating that this is a high order thinking skill question or HOTS question. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this terminology, high order thinking skill questions significant. The most primary difference between that and the low order thinking skill question is that high order thinking skill questions or HOTS questions require discussion and evaluation. Right, so it's not a simple matter of explaining something. There's a discussion component necessary, and that's followed by an evaluation. Now, so the directive word here is to discuss. Now, what are you meant to be discussing? That's called the object of your discussion. In this case, the words that come right after the word discuss. Discuss what? Whether the data is sufficient, right? This is the object of the discussion. So in your final answer to this question, you're supposed to conclude, is the data sufficient or is the data not sufficient? And if it's sufficient, to what degree is it sufficient? To a high degree of sufficiency or maybe barely sufficient perhaps, right? So the discussion involves yes versus no, and then to what extent as well. So this type of question that asks you to discuss whether the data is sufficient is what we call a high order thinking skill, sufficiency of data question. Now note that this kind of high order question do not appear in essay paper, because in essay they typically will not give you specific data, right? So this will be questions that often, well, actually to be fair, it's not even often. It gets tested in case study once in a while, right? And it's usually a high order question. Now, what's the answering technique to answer a sufficiency of data question, high order sufficiency data question? In a case study, you are using a TAE or thesis, antithesis evaluation question. For those of you who are Raffles students, right, I believe your teachers use a slightly different terminology. They call it TAS, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So for all intents and purposes, you can just treat the two as synonymous, TAE and TAS. They're not exactly the same thing, but for now, good enough to think of it as synonymous, right? All right, so what is this TAE or TAS approach? So first, the thesis would be to look at the data that is provided in the table and say, okay, how can we use this data, or what specific information in the data can I use to compare material SOL and non-material SOL for Japan versus USA, right? To be able to draw a conclusion. How can the data allow us to draw a conclusion as to whether Japan or USA had the higher material SOL? How can the data allow us to draw a conclusion about whether Japan or America had a higher non-material SOL? Right. After that, then we need to move on to the antithesis to say how the data might not be sufficient in allowing us to make such comparisons. Right. So this would be the antithesis to this question. Now, let's look at the thesis, for example. How would we compare? How do we look at what economic data can I use here to compare material SOL? Well, if you look at the GDP per capita using PPP, right, Japan's value is $23,235 US, while USA's PPP value was $27,821. With America having a higher PPP GDP per capita value, this allows us to draw some conclusion that on average per person, the Americans enjoy a higher purchasing power than the Japanese people, right? When I say Japanese people, I don't necessarily mean nationality, people in Japan, right? Because GDP is less about nationality, is about the people within Japan in 1996, right? So people in America don't all have to be Americans. People in Japan don't all have to be Japanese. So we're talking about people in USA versus people in Japan, not people of USA versus people of Japan. All right, so people in America seems to be enjoying a higher purchasing power than people in Japan. Now, important thing to note here is that you cannot simply say that, oh, this number, 23235 versus 27821, tells me that people in America enjoy a higher material SOL because they have a higher purchasing power, full stop, right? That's not good enough, because that involves you reading the data, drawing a conclusion and claiming the conclusion to be true without an explanation as to why would that be the case. Why would the value for PPP GDP per capita allow us to arrive at that conclusion that people in America enjoy on average a higher material as well? Right, so please elaborate on that. So talk about how PPP GDP relates to purchasing power, and with a greater purchasing power on average per person, that means that people in America on average per person are able to buy material, more goods and services to fulfill their material needs and wants, thereby leading to a higher material standard of living on average per person, right? Now, then in terms of what data can I use for comparison of non-material standard of living? Well, the most suitable piece of data in this table is to look at the infant mortality rate per 1,000 live births per annum. So in Japan, for example, the value was 4.3, meaning that out of every 1,000 live births in 1996 in Japan, on average, right, 4.3 did not survive, right? For America, the number is way higher at 8%. This would suggest that as far as quality of healthcare or the accessibility to healthcare in America might not be as good as that in Japan, at least in the year 1996, right? So this will be one aspect of non-material SOL that you can consider. Now, some students might, I believe some students say, hey, well, how about this value here? Televisions per 1,000 inhabitants. Would that be a suitable indicator to use? It can be, but there are a lot of problems with such an indicator. Number one, having more televisions per 1,000 inhabitants doesn't suggest too much about how much leisure time people have, because having televisions, maybe because we simply bought more televisions, right? Americans simply bought more televisions per 1,000 people. Whether or not they have had time to watch the television isn't recorded here. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, even if they did watch more television, presumably suggesting they had more leisure time to watch TV, there's nothing to say that people in different cultures, right, would be spending their leisure time engaging in the same kind of activities. Maybe the Japanese are not too keen on spending their leisure time watching TV, right? So between televisions per 1,000 inhabitants and infant mortality rate would clearly be a slightly better indicator to use, right? So choose one, right? Choose the one more suitable. Just like look at the above GDP per head. There are two versions. There's a PPP version and there's a current exchange rate version. We are going to choose the better version of the data given that it's available, right? So in this case, you can conclude that for the still in the thesis, that the data would suggest that on the material SOL side, the Americans seem to be doing better than the Japanese. Again, I will correct myself. The people in America seem to be doing better than the people in Japan on the material side. And in terms of the non-material side, but at least for equality of and access to healthcare, the people in Japan seem to be doing a little better than the people in America. Maybe not a little, maybe more than a little better, right? So this would be the information you can glean from here. Now, that's thesis. How about antithesis then? So antithesis, you're going to make arguments that, wait a minute, the data provided may not be so conclusive. The conclusions that we can draw from such data may not always be so ironclad, right? That surely this is the case. There are holes that we can poke in those conclusions. For example, right, that these are some of the arguments you can choose to present. For instance, you say that whilst PPP GDP per capita does provide us with a good way to compare the purchasing power of the average person in Japan versus the average person in USA, per capita is really nothing more than what is called an arithmetic mean. We take the total PPP GDP, divide by the total population of people in that country, right? It's a simple average. Does it mean that each person has the same amount of money? Could it be that income distribution in one of these countries is very skewed towards the rich, while in the other country, it might not be as skewed to the rich? So then the average person, right, from a mean value point of view, yes, America seems to be doing better in terms of purchasing power, right? But how about if we look at median person, right? Is that necessarily still true then that the median person in America is doing better than the median person in Japan in terms of purchasing power? So here we are talking about the data may not be sufficient because we only have information as to, on average per person, as a mean value, how much purchasing power people in Japan versus how much people in America has. But in reality, how that purchasing power is distributed amongst the people of each country, that information is unavailable in the table given. Right? So that's one argument you can make, that make us pause, make us question that conclusion that we drew earlier. Is that really always, is that conclusion we drew earlier necessarily true? Right? So you need to demonstrate the ability to question the validity of our own arguments that we presented in the thesis. Now, then, second example, you might say that, well, infant mortality rate is an indicator of one aspect, right, of the quality of healthcare or accessible healthcare. But there are other indicators. Maybe Japan was doing a lot better than America in terms of infant mortality rate. But what about life expectancy, right? What about number of hospital beds or number of ICU beds per 10,000 people? How about the doctor to patient ratio in the country? That could also reflect accessibility to healthcare. How about affordability? So there are many aspects of quality of and accessibility healthcare that are not comparable given the information. All we have was one outcome indicator, healthcare outcomes pertaining to infant mortality only, right? So you might argue that that information is a little bit narrow and a little bit presumptuous, right, for us to use that one indicator to extrapolate to say that accessibility to healthcare and quality of healthcare was higher in Japan in 1996 than in USA, right? Furthermore, you can also argue that non-material SOL is surely more than just about healthcare, right? It can also be about other non-material aspects such as quality of education, accessibility to education, amount of leisure, quality of leisure that people enjoy, right? The quality of the physical environment. So there are many other aspects of non-material standard of living that the data in the table doesn't provide any basis for comparison. So for the antithesis, do not go talk about too many such points. Given that this is a 10-mark question, I would suggest one counter argument pertaining to the way we draw a conclusion on the material side, and one counter argument for the non-material side, right? To give you enough scope from both material and non-material indicator, why we don't think that it might be sufficient, right? And then elaborate well on the problems that arise from drawing conclusion rather than spam many points, right? The last thing you want to do is to show the examiner, I'm a good memorizer, I memorize many different points, but I fail to elaborate on any of the ideas, right? So don't go for quantity, go for two ideas, explain each of the two ideas sufficiently thoroughly, showcasing your understanding and your economic theory. All right, so, but do take note, the mark allocation is only 10 marks, so you also don't want to write a 3-page essay on this. All right, so after you have presented your antithesis, then we now move to the evaluation. So what is clear from the data is that there are some useful information that allows us to compare material SOL as well as non-material SOL, meaning the PPP GDP per capita for material, infant mortality rate for the non-material standard of living. It is also clear from the data that it is not sufficient for us to draw a conclusion that is unequivocal that America is better in terms of material, Japan is better in non-material. It's not sufficient for us to be very confident of those conclusions. Therefore, our stand is it is not sufficient to give us a unequivocal conclusion. However, to what degree then is it able to give us an ability to draw a conclusion that we are confident enough to be a meaningful conclusion to say that even though the data provided will not give us a perfect picture, are we sufficiently confident that we can meaningfully conclude that America is doing better than Japan in 1996 materially in terms of material SOL, and Japan was doing better in a non-material SOL. So you need to be able to cast a judgment and form your opinion, or what we call your stand on this issue. Again, often the Cambridge examiner as well as your school teacher doesn't set up the exam question answer key, right, with a predetermined stand, right? They're willing to accept either view that you have. They are more interested in how you justify their view. So while stating the stand is a requirement for you in the answer, it won't earn you a single mark simply having a stand. And certainly not in case study, right? Essay, you get a mark if, for simply stating your stand on the correct issue. But for case study, you don't even earn a mark for this, right? So you only start earning your marks when you justify why you thought so, right? And the basis of deciding why you thought so, whichever is your stand, will be the logic of your argument, whether your argument makes sense or not. All right, so for this last question, so you follow a thesis, antithesis, and evaluation structure. All right, so that's the end of the discussion on this test question. Hope that has helped. If in future you have any questions that you want me to help go through, please let me know and I'll find time to do a video on this. All right, then we'll stop here. Thank you very much.